it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker. It's Dr. Jamil Faccin. He's currently a postdoctoral researcher at K-State, and he received his DVM degree in Brazil. For 4 years, he worked with Brazil's largest swine production company in Brazil, Brazil Foods, and in one of his roles, he did work closely in Gilt Development Unit Manager. Later, he did his master's and his PhD with Dr. Fernando Bortoloso, focusing on management and feeding strategies for nursery and finishing pigs. In his current role at K-State, he is involved in research extension, dye formulation, data management, and he is part of a feed biosecurity team in the US SHIP program. So, thank you very much for being here today.
Hello. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Mike, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be speaking in this workshop today. For those that had the opportunity to interact with Dr. George Foxcroft, I met him twice in Brazil, and I assume that all of you here in this room understand the legacy that George made for the whole, the global industry. So today we're going to talk about nourishing a long-term investment. And I know that right now talking about investment is probably not the best timing. Think on the negative margins of the swine industry nowadays. But something that I like to do when I give classes at K-State is to bring some cultural aspects from the place where I come from, so Brazil. And I'm kind of frustrated that there are so many Brazilians here, so my jokes here will be not that funny for the ones that already understand those jokes. But today I'm going to start teaching you one very, very typical Brazilian word. That is gambiarra. And see, there are many. This word is kind of weird to translate, but when I put in Google, I found that kludge, it's actually the definition of gambiarra. So it's a workaround, quick and dirty solution that is clumsy, inelegant, inefficient, difficult to extend, hard to maintain. And that's exactly what we want to keep away from gilt development. When we think about pig production, there are so many ways to feed a pig. There are so many ways to raise a pig. But when we think about gilt development, sometimes we treat gilts like another animal, another growing animal. And here, it's exactly what we don't want to do. And also, you guys also have seen so many images like this. And this is my MRI, something that happened with a gambiarra in one of a gilt development barn. In the company where I used to work, we need to increase gilts coming from outside GDUs, and I was responsible to do preg check in these GDUs. And one of these GDUs were previous finishing barn. So there was basically no structure for raising developmental gilts. That's an example of gambiarra. What happened? If you can see here, if you understand a little bit of anatomy, here's the discal hernia that I have right here because of doing preg checks in pens. So I was basically chasing gilts, trying to do the preg check for months and months and months. Then I developed this. This is an outcome from a gambiarra. Is that exactly what we don't want to do? I like to treat gilt development like a butterfly effect. If you watch this movie, but even if you don't, the butterfly effect is something like a wing flap from a butterfly in South America can generate a tornado downstream in Kansas, for example. Not that we are responsible for all tornadoes that we have in Kansas, but the idea is that, and in this morning it was mentioned that everything that you do in previous ages, previous lives, you can have some consequences. And that's why I want to bring this idea of a long-time investment, because everything that we do in early ages, early life in gilts could generate some outcomes, good and bad. That sow that is a parity 7 with an average of 15 piglet born, for sure, is a consequence of a butterfly effect. But also that sow that was culled parity 2 with a poor performance in parity 1, it's also a consequence of something that we did before. So this is the outline for the presentation today. So we're going to talk briefly about grower and developer phase, vitamins and trace mineral, a huge topic that the industry is discussing nowadays, and I appreciate Sergio's presentation this afternoon, talking a little bit about slow growth and strategies to slow growth of overweight gilts being bred, a little bit of flushing and gestation. So let's start with grower phase. The main message here is that do not overthink. Sometimes we try to complicate and think that the nutrition program needs to be completely different than another pig or a commercial or a more, a commercial pig. So do not overthink. So basically things here, maintain high health status, keep replacements separate from other pigs. Of course, we know that health challenges impair performance. Of course, for management and nutrition strategies, if we keep them separated, will be better. And also, one of the main points when we talk about differences in nutrition in replacement gilts comparing to commercial animals is phosphorus levels. And when we talk about more phosphorus, we know that phosphorus is very well related and it's important to lean growth, but also here with gilts, we are more interested in the structure, so bone mineralization. This graph is from Dr. Hans Stein's group, and the idea here is to show you, and I saw in many of the presentations today talking about calcium and phosphorus, here is just an example to show that when we talk about calcium and phosphorus, we should not treat these two minerals separated. We should focus on the relationship. Here is basically, we have 4 different levels of digestible phosphorus, and here, as we increase digestible calcium, we see the difference, the interaction that we have between the relationship of these two minerals. If you focus on this green line here, where we are below NRC requirement, as we increase calcium in the diet, we decrease performance. So it's too simple and it's too wrong to mention, let's just increase calcium. So when we think about calcium, we need to think about phosphorus as well and the relationship. And here is just to show you that the peak of average daily gain is different depending on how much digestible phosphorus you have in your diet. And the idea here, why I'm bringing this, is because we have so many other ingredients other than limestone or calcium carbonate bringing calcium to the pig diet that we need to consider. Feed additives can have calcium as a carrier, antibiotics, some other specialty protein ingredients. So we need to consider that. Otherwise, if we are too wide in the calcium to phosphorus relation, we can have some decrease in performance and also some decrease in bone mineralization. So here is Carine-Veer data. So here, just to show you the difference when we focus on phosphorus to income over feed cost, here in the right, that is basically a profit measure. And when we focus on ash, so bone mineralization, this is in the x-axis we have the percentage to the NRC in phosphorus in both studies. And here you can see that the amount of phosphorus that maximizes income over feed cost, so profit, is 113% of the NRC requirement. But when we go to ash, more thinking on bones, we have 131%. So it's clear that when we want to formulate diets focused on bone mineralization, we probably will be a little higher than when we think about maximizing average daily gain. So that's another thing that brings the long time investment to the table. We understand that we are just adding more costs. Of course, one diet, higher phosphorus will represent most of the times higher cost. So that's one of the things. But we are talking about the most expensive and one of the most important animals in pig production. So vitamins and trace minerals, we did most of you are aware of the survey that we conduct later last year and were published this year. So we did a US survey trying to understand how much vitamin and how much trace mineral the industry is currently using, updating Josh Floor's survey that he did in 2016. And we could conclude a lot of different, we conclude a lot of different stuff with the material that we collect. First, more is not always better. And here, talking specifically about vitamins, sometimes we think that we should add more vitamins, thinking that vitamins are key for development of repro organs or also bones, and also we will increase and benefit health just by adding more, which actually is not true. And actually the benefit and how much we can interfere in gilt development with nutritional strategy is not that big. So we need to focus on that. Sometimes we put too much blame in nutrition, and we think that the solutions are completely related to nutrition as well. So, and it's not that true. So why people think that more is better and try to use this margin of safety mindset? Probably because vitamins and trace mineral represents less than 2% of the cost of the diet. So we don't want to be too marginal it's not going to change the feed cost. And also, we have a limited knowledge. When you go to the NRC chapters for vitamins specifically, you see that there are vitamins that has not been published one single paper in the last 15 years. So, and then we think that adding more of these vitamins will fix everything related to something when we think about gilt development. And we have various factors affecting the stability of vitamins particularly. That's why most of the mineral companies are suggesting, and this is true actually, that with organic and chelated or basically non-inorganic trace minerals, you can protect a little bit more the life of a vitamin. So the inorganic minerals, they usually reduce the stability of the vitamin. So this is also important when we are talking about formulating diets for gilts. About the margin of safety, I already said, and we don't have NRC specific requirements for gilts. And that's something that was interesting because when I received back the information from 36 swine nutritionists from 36 different companies, when gathering this information, we have so many different ways to think about the VTM premix for gilts. That was quite interesting. We have companies that they produce an own VTM for gilts, or they mix nursery and sows, or they do like nursery premix and then sows during the grow finishing phase. You know, there are so many differences, which represents a lot of variation. And when I talk about variation, this graph represents all vitamins and all trace minerals for this survey. And here in this green line represents the industry average of all single vitamins and all single minerals. And I wanted to point out 3 vitamins here that are known to be responsible for some physiology in repro, and there are pyridoxine, biotin, and folic acid. All these 3 vitamins has some repro functions, and look the variation that we have. If you imagine, for example, using 1 milligram per kilogram of folic acid, we have companies using 0.3 and companies using 4.3. So a huge difference. So, and that goes back to the limited knowledge. We have limited knowledge in this thing. So that's why we're not saying that now this is the silver bullet. Once we do research on this, we're going to have the solution for gilt development, vitamin and trace mineral. But the idea is that we don't know sometimes what we are doing. So we play in margin of safety. So I went to literature to see what we have in biotin, since it's one of those vitamins. So one of the most recent studies that has some application to commercial swine production was done in 1985. So not supplementing biotin versus supplementing 220 micrograms per kilos, reduced the total number of toe lesions and also severity of lesions. But you agree with me that this data is a bit outdated. So how can we recommend this for nowadays type of production? About pyridoxine, from 67 until this year, we have basically 3 studies that we could apply something in the currently swine production, but none of them are related to gilt development. And for folic acid, we have Dr. Thaler here showing some different levels of supplementation of folic acid, and the level of 1.65 represented improvement in total pig-born. But look at these numbers. So this is the total pig-born of 1989. So how about nowadays? So another thing that we should pay attention when going to NRC or going to some recommendation books. Sometimes we have a percentage, ppm, milligrams per kilo, but we're not considering how much of feed intake that animal is actually intaking. So this is another point. Your farm could have pigs eating half a kilo more than my farm. So that's the thing that we need to consider when trying to address like the amount of that nutrient per day. A little bit on minerals here. I don't want to take so many time talking about, I have some slide about OCD, but I think that we covered that topic today. So here is some data, quite interesting data, showing the effect of chelated trace minerals in reducing lameness during rearing and also at the end of lactation. And this study has shown some interesting results regardless of the strategy that you use, either minerals, methionine, or both. They were able to reduce lameness. There are some, as I mentioned, when you use a non-inorganic source of trace minerals, you increase the bioavailability of that nutrient, but we actually don't know if that's exactly the mode of action here. We can also argue that we are protecting, we are increasing the stability of the vitamins. So there are two good ideas, but we cannot conclude. But one of the interesting results here showing these affecting lameness. So now I will start talking a little bit more on slow growth, so tackling overweight. Nice presentation from Sergio giving us an introduction of the issue of nowadays, but I wanted to highlight first that when we say slow growth, when we say restrict feed, we are not talking about feeding animals below maintenance. We are talking about trying to moderate the growth to reduce the percentage of sows, of gilts that are bred overweight. And the questions that come to our mind is that who are the gilts that we want to restrict? How many of them? When we should restrict? How and for how long? So many questions. We have some recent data that has been published in the last 2 years. I will show you some, but it's not completely established. But there are some ideas on how to restrict growth or slow growth of gilts. So a little bit of the background. So this recent study, so overweight and lactation intake, this recent study showed that 164 kilos reduced lactation feed intake. So this is one of the most important things. If we reduce the lactation feed intake of P1, we for sure will have some negative outcomes at parity 2. Sometimes we can reduce retention rate, so pretty important. Also some structure issues, some studies showing that when you breed gilts from 170 to 200 kilos, we are increasing the number of gilts culled over 3 parities for locomotion reasons. And here you can group all lameness issues. And also thinking, it was mentioned this morning, think about the lifetime maintenance needed from a gilt that was bred with 140 versus 170 kilos. Think how much more money, energy, feed you need to spend to keep that gilt that was bred at 170 in an ideal body weight, ideal body condition. The cost of keeping that animal will be a lot higher. Some Jenny's data here. This is kind of an interesting one, and here is important to mention that these values of birth weight are the litter average, so it's not individual birth weight, but just showing that gilts from heavy birth weight litters needs to be managed to prevent them from becoming too heavy at first mating. And here, please don't consider that I'm recommending now that we should keep less than 1.18 kilos gilt at birth, because here the 3 different colors has completely different numbers of samples. So those gilts that were bred here, the starting point here is the breeding time. So of course, from a survivability standpoint, gilts that were born with less than 1 kilo will have like a higher percentage of being cool or reduced survivability percentage. So that means that the idea of these 2 slides is that the retention rate we reduce it for those gilts that came from heavy litters. And this is an indication of who are these gilts. So it's important to note that. And also here, as I mentioned, look what happened in parity 2. So it seems that they kind of have like the same number of total born in all first 4 parities, first 4 pharaohs, but look what happened in at parity 2, so at the second pharaoh. Probably something related to an overweighted gilt that didn't eat enough at lactation, then has some effects on the second farrowing. So a little bit of background of the effects of having overweight gilts being bred. But then one idea comes to mind like, well, and how about memory development? You are recommending us to reduce growth, to restrict growth, but are we affecting anything for good or bad in memory development? If you're not aware about Chantal's farmer review in nutrition for memory development, you should go find this paper. It's very, very interesting. And in that paper, Chantal mentioned 3 key moments for memory development. And these are the 3 key moments. So basically from day 90 to puberty, the last half of gestation, and the first lactation. We are talking about avoiding gilts being overweight at the first mating. So we are not considering doing any restriction, of course, in gestation or lactation. So we'll be targeting at this point, but of course, we don't want to be so aggressive reducing that feed intake to impair memory development. This spreadsheet is from Chantal's review, and basically those 3 moments are very well separated here. So from day 90 to puberty, some papers, in gestation, some other papers, and in lactation, some other papers. But the goal here, since we are targeting day 90 to puberty, they usually compare, the studies usually compare ad libitum versus a percentage of feed restriction. But when we go to these papers from early 2000, we see that the ad libitum feeding level is what we are having nowadays, kind of a control feed intake. So it's hard to compare the amount of feed that these animals are eating when we compare nowadays production versus 20 years ago production. So what we want to target here, I understand that it's a bit broad, but we don't want to restrict too much during this phase, the feed intake, because we can decrease parenchymal DNA and weight if we restrict too much feed intake. Of course, we don't want to do anything in gestation to reduce growth, and also neither in lactation. One of the strategies that was already published from these authors, they reduce by 25% the energy intake of animals from 120 to 230 days of age. And it was kind of very effective, but one can argue that here the ad libitum has 7% more gilts reaching puberty by day 230. So keep in mind that if we are thinking in some strategies to slow growth, we can have some negative effects of having some delay in puberty. So that will affect for sure the number of gilts, the number of available gilts, how many gilts we need to breed to reach the target. But in the other side, if you see here the body weight at first farrow, the authors were able to reduce by 7 kilos, which is around 15 pounds, the body weight at first farrow. And although we don't have any statistical difference here in the farrowing performance, all numerical differences are in favor of the restriction intake. So that's something that it's an important information and could be one of the strategies using the information that these authors have. Another recent study conducted by the University of Arkansas together with PIC and JBS, they provided 2 different diets, an adequate and a low density diets, if you will. So in this low density diet has wheat meats and also DDGs. So reducing the amount of energy and reducing also the digestible lysine, ending up with a low SID lysine to calorie ratio compared to an adequate diet. And they allow pigs to eat these diets from 23 kilos, so right after nursery, until 127, getting close to breeding time. And they track these animals from P1 to P4, so for longevity and also performance. What they found, again, effective result here. They were able to reduce average daily gain from those almost 100 days. So by, of course, decreasing or getting a poorer feed efficiency. So the animals from the low treatment ate a little more, but actually they were less efficient. So that's why they have a smaller or lower average daily gain. At the end of the treatments, they got 7 kilos lighter animals with the low treatment, and at breeding they are still 5 kilos lighter than the other treatment. But keep in mind that, well, if they were at 7 and rapidly they are at 5, so once we move these animals to getting close to breed, we will allow them to eat a little bit more. They have a faster capacity to compensate growth. So no matter how much time you spend restricting the growth, the intake to slow growth, if you let them eat like ad libitum feed for a few days, they can easily compensate, and then you basically lose time. So one of the consequences also of these studies was a benefit on improving lactation feed intake for the low, since we have a little lighter gilt farrowing, so they ate more during lactation. As I mentioned, they track longevity, and here is until parity 4, and they found a tendency for the low treatment to have a higher retention, or survivability rate also in this trial. Coming back to the compensatory capacity, for you to keep in mind, I found this data from a Danish herd, and they also tried 2 different strategies. It's a little weird how they define the treatment, so semi-ad libitum and restrictive. But basically, the restrictive, they gave a little less feed compared to the other. They started this trial with day 124 until day 201, and basically look what they found. So 130 grams of average daily gain less, so very, very efficient. So they were 8 kilos lighter than the semi-ad libitum. But then they let ad libitum feed from day 200 until breeding, and look what happened. Now the restrictive group grow a lot faster, and at farrowing they are basically at the same body weight. So this is something very, very important. When we talk about restricting growth, we need to understand the biology of the animal and the capacity that these animals have to compensate growth. So an overview of this slow growth strategy, some other approaches. We always talk to some nutritionists, and we always recommend, when talking about gilt development, review the diet formulation. We are trained to be formulating diets to improve growth, to increase average daily gain, to sometimes maximize growth, to improve feed efficiency, and we have this mindset. But for gilts, when we are talking about slow growth, we need to switch a little bit. Because just one example, we were reviewing some gilt development diets from a company, good size company, and they had 2 feed additives and really high copper for the whole growth finishing period of that gilt that probably were there just by accident. No, it's actually because they are just using similar formulation to the finishing commercial pigs. So they're kind of stimulating growth for these animals, but actually there's no role for having those ingredients in that diet. Fiber, it's an interesting one because, like most of the farms here in the US, raise gilts in ad libitum feed. We don't have like hand feeding or limiting feeding. So we think that by adding fiber, we will restrict growth of the animals. But when you have space, the animals can easily compensate the intake, and sometimes you don't reach any result by when you weigh these pigs. They are quite similar because they compensate in feed intake, and you also can have some feed flow troubles. I would be really nervous to recommend any changes in feeder space or stocking density, because of course we don't want to face welfare or tail biting issues. And also with that same idea of having the mindset of focus on weight gain, if we are trying to reduce growth or slow growth, try to identify those farms that have, for example, wet-dry feeder or pelleted diets that probably are helping to increase growth performance of those animals. And as mentioned before, each system has its own body weight distribution. So my GDU could have 11% of gilts in that fraction of overweight, but a different farm could have 30%. So try to identify in your system, as I put it here in this bell-shaped curve, depending on the system, the chunk of the animal will be different. So that's the goal. So try to identify before moving on to some strategies of restricting growth, because something important, we're not saying that now you're gonna formulate diets for these animals and another diet for these animals. We cannot do that in our farms, so we probably will need to apply something to the whole population. So moving on to flushing, since we are coming and now we restricted the growth and what we should do talking about flushing. And one of the studies that I want to share is from Dr. Rob Knox's group when Andrea Malman was here conducting some research. Basically, this study, it's a 2x2 factorial where there was 2 different feeding levels between the first and second estrus and 2 different feeding levels between second and third estrus. And here, basically, flush feeding between first and second or second and third estrus actually increase ovulation rate. You can see here, increase here and also increase here. But this is ovulation rate. When we move to identify the number of embryos, the viable embryos on day 30, look what happened. It improved ovulation rate, but it only improves viable embryos between first and second estrus. So only this group of gilts were benefited with higher number of embryos because when we just increase the feed intake between first and second estrus. And of course, these gilts were bred at the third estrus. Another study that brings some idea on timing standpoint on when we should apply or not the flushing is basically giving for 7 days prior to breeding or giving to longer periods. And here in this study, here is back fat. So when we give for longer periods during the luteal phase, for example here, around 14 days, 18 days, more feed represented higher back fat, bigger back fat. But when we give only for 7 days, we haven't seen that. But when we move to total born here, what happened here? So we basically have the same number, so 16 total born, but this treatment has higher total born. So flush feeding for a period of less than 7 days before breeding tend to improve total born in gilts with less back fat reserve. What does that mean? Is that if we are already at the target body weight, or if we are sometimes higher than the target or reaching 150, 160 kilograms, there's no benefit of give any flush feed to these animals because they already are in the target body weight. So I know that this data is kind of hard to understand kind of fast, so we put together this slide that kind of summarize the flushing management, feeding management. So for gilts that are up to target weight, so they are not at the target weight yet, we can improve ovulation rate and total born. But if the gilts are over target weight, we can improve ovulation rate, but not total born. If you breed gilts in the second estrus with what is really the majority of the gilts in the GDUs nowadays, you can improve ovulation rate and total born, but if it's in the third or later estrus, a huge animal, we probably won't improve anything. We won't improve total born. And from a timing standpoint, 7 days before breeding, if gilts are at or above target weight, so you don't need to give 21 days or 14 days if a gilt is already at the target body weight. And then this is kind of rare. If you are planning to breed that gilt because you need to reach the breeding target for higher than 18 days for gilts below target weight and age. Finishing the presentation with gestation, I just want to mention, to bring some studies that did different treatments or different amounts of feed for gilts, and splitting the gestation in 2 parts, so early gestation and late gestation. In early gestation, there are quite a few studies in literature, and here I put together a table. You don't need to pay attention to these numbers. We conclude that when we increasing feed levels was only beneficial when control was near maintenance. We are kind of comparing increasing feed intake versus a close to maintenance level. Of course, we can generate some benefit because the control group is kind of too low. But of course, and also if you use high feeding levels, and here high is getting close to 4 kilos, 3.5 kilos in the first 2 weeks or month of gestation, we can have some detrimental results, basically reducing embryo survivability and plasma progesterone. But the topic that is more practical nowadays, and not nowadays, it's been a while since we discussed bump feeding. Here is recent data from Leman and others showing that 2 different levels, 2 different feed allowance, here gilts, here sows, no difference in birth weight. So basically, no different response. But as mentioned before in some other presentations, what is the impact of increasing feed intake during late gestation on lactation feed intake? This is another study, and this is 4 different levels of gestation feed allowance from 1.8 to 3.3. And look what happened with the lactation feed intake. You see the red line here, that it's always high, more feed intake, higher feed intake, lactation feed intake, belongs to this group that were allowed 1.8 kilos during gestation, during the last days on gestation. And you see here the black and the green, they are kind of slow to start, so gilts or P1s are eating less if they ate too much during the last days in gestation. But then the question that always comes up is, well, but I don't want to restrict or I need to bump feed because of colostrum production. And these authors also, they collect this information, and they found that as you increase feed intake in late gestation for gilts, you can actually reduce colostrum yield. And that's the thing, that is an important message, that sometimes we think that biology is like math. You increase here, you collect here. But sometimes we don't have all the information. We don't know. There are many things that we don't know. And in this data, basically increasing feed intake reduces colostrum yield. Getting back to the title of this presentation, the long-term investment, I really think that if we care more, if we think more that a gilt is a valuable asset to our pig production, that is something that we will treat different. Here is an investment that I have that in the last 3 months I lost 30%. There was not much money, so 29 bucks. And this, it's pretty similar to how I see gilt development, because we keep feeding an animal, rearing an animal to reach sometimes the break even after 2 years, 2.5 years, when we are harvesting her third progeny. So it's hard. We just add and add money to find a break even 2.5 years later. But actually that's what happened. This same investment was part of this same curve was part of this time. So actually that's what I mean when I say long-term investment, because once you do good things, not only in nutrition, but good practices, good management with gilt development, you can collect and you can have a profit in the end. So really appreciate your time and attention. It's nice to see some familiar faces, also nice to see some of my mentors here, Dr. David Barcelos and Dr. Steve Dritz here in the audience. If you want to receive our newsletter with our new publications, you can scan this QR code, and appreciate your time again. I will be happy to answer any question.
Thank you very much, Jamil. Do we have any questions from the audience? I have a quick question. So you're talking about like the feeding during gestation and what that means. But when you're looking at feeding at gestation, are you looking to end up with a target farrowing weight for gilts entering first farrowing? first lactation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Depending on the genetics, you see different recommendations. I would say that for sure not heavier than 200 kilos, then need to convert for pounds. But we normally see most of the farms having 190, 195 kilos as a good target, if you will, to see if your strategies are working or not, or if you are generating too many overweight gilts.
At an empty farrowing rate, so post-farrowing? Or
Post-farrowing, yep, post-farrowing.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Okay. With that, say thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, Jenny.
We learned a lot from you today.